The night I am going to tell you about ends with 200 people watching a woman who never raises her voice raise it, and it begins 9 months earlier with me holding a recipe card so old the ink had gone the color of weak tea, telling myself that being invisible was a kind of safety. I want to say that up front, because everything else in this story only makes sense once you understand how stupidly wrong I was. My name is Wren Ashgrove. I was 27 years old, an Omega, and I had spent 4 years as a pastry cook at the Gilded Thorn, the flagship restaurant of the Vale Table Group, without a single person outside the kitchen learning my last name. That was not an accident. I had made myself small on purpose, the way you learn to walk quietly in a house where the floor creaks under the wrong foot. Suppressant patch on my hip, apron 3 sizes too big because the smalls never got ordered, hands that could tell you the exact ratio of butter to flour in a crust by touch alone. Nobody asked me to demonstrate that. Nobody asked me much of anything. I filled pastry bags and wept quietly into egg whites when a whisk slipped and cut me, and at the end of every shift I walked past the wall of framed reviews that never mentioned my name and let myself in the back door of my studio apartment, where my younger sister's crayon drawings were still taped to the refrigerator 11 years after she'd stopped needing me to raise her, and I had somehow never stopped paying for that privilege. The kitchen had its own weather system, and Bastian Cray was most of the bad fronts. He was a line cook 2 stations down, an alpha built like a door, and he had a specific, practiced cruelty for omegas who didn't fight back. "Careful, ghost," he'd say when I passed behind him with a tray, not moving his elbow an inch. "Wouldn't want you to disappear before service." The others laughed the way people laugh at things they're too tired to object to. I let it slide off because sliding was what I was good at. I had one thing that was mine, one thing I never told anyone about, which was that I did not forget a taste. Not once, not ever. I could eat a dish blind and tell you the vinegar, the varietal, the minute the butter had browned past nutty into burnt. My grandmother used to test me with it when I was 9 years old, standing on a step stool in her kitchen in Millbrook, and when she died, she left me one thing, a recipe card scorched black along one corner from the year the stove caught fire. Her handwriting for a burnt sugar tart that no bakery in 3 counties could reproduce because she'd never written down the last step. I carried that card in my apron pocket every single shift. It was not sentiment, or it was not only sentiment. It was proof that once someone had looked directly at me and decided I was worth teaching. The person nobody in that kitchen had to be taught to fear was Rosen Vale. She owned the building we cooked in and 11 others like it across 4 cities, and the industry papers called her the Vale Wolf with the kind of respect people reserve for weather events. She fired executive chefs by text message. She had, according to Odalis Fenn, our general manager and Rosen's second for 12 years, personally closed a restaurant that made her mother cry once, just once, over a badly poured glass of wine. She almost never came into the kitchen. When she did, conversation stopped the way it stops in a forest when something large moves through it. I had spoken to her exactly 4 times in 4 years, and none of those times had lasted longer than it takes to say excuse me. What nobody in the kitchen said out loud, because you did not say it out loud, was that the last week of October was different. Elodie Vale had died 6 years ago that week, and every year on the anniversary, the Gilded Thorn hosted a private staff dinner that Rosen attended in person, sat through in near silence, and left within the hour. Odalis briefed the whole kitchen on it like a storm warning. "Steady hands," she told us. "No mistakes tonight." And there was one dish, only one, that had to be perfect. Elodie's burnt honey torte, made once a year from a recipe so closely guarded that only the pastry chef of record, a woman named Corvina, who had quit in September without notice, was supposed to know how to make it. Which meant that on the 29th of October, at 4 in the afternoon, Odalise stood in the doorway of the pastry station and said the sentence that started everything. "Ashgrove, you're plating the torte tonight. There's no one else." I told her I had never made it. She told me I had 6 hours to learn how, because the recipe existed only in Corvina's head, and Corvina was not answering her phone. I did not tell Odalise the truth, which was that I had tasted that torte exactly once at my hiring trial 4 years earlier, a single forkful set in front of me by a woman I did not yet know was the owner's mother, testing candidates the way she'd once told the papers she tested wine. I remembered it the way I remembered everything. 6 hours felt like a door slamming shut behind me, and I walked through it anyway, because the alternative was watching the Veil Wolf's face when the one dish that mattered didn't arrive. The kitchen went dark blue with dusk while I worked. Baston passed my station twice and said something about ghosts learning new tricks. I didn't answer him. I had 90 minutes left and a torte that tasted almost right, almost was going to get someone fired. At 7:04, the pass phone rang. Odalise's voice, flat and fast. "The private room's seated. She's here early." I looked down at the torte, at the card in my apron pocket, and understood that the next few minutes were going to decide something, though I did not yet know what. I did not know then that the version I served that night was about to change the rest of my life, because at 7:19, I discovered the ganache Corvina had left labeled and chilled for exactly this dish had been swapped, the good batch replaced with a day-old scrap someone hadn't bothered to throw out. I found out much later, though I want you to hold on to it now, that Bastien had done that on purpose, certain the ghost would fail loudly enough to finally be fired. I did not know that yet. I only knew I had 11 minutes and no ganache, and a room full of grief waiting on the other side of a door I had never once walked through. I rebuilt it from memory. That was the only tool I had. I closed my eyes over the saucepan and let my grandmother's voice walk me through the burn point, past scorched, to the exact edge where sugar turns to something like smoke and stops just before it turns to something like ash. 4 minutes to reduce. 3 to fold. The clock over the pass read 7:31 when I set the finished plate in Odalise's hands, and she looked at it and looked at me and said nothing at all, which from Odalise was the closest thing to a blessing I had ever received. I was not supposed to go into the private room. Servers carried food. Cooks stayed in the kitchen. But the server assigned to dessert had been pulled for a spill in the main room, and Odalise, out of options, shoved the tray at me and said go, now, before it drops below temperature. So I walked through a door I had spent 4 years avoiding, into low gold light and a long table of Veil Table Group executives sitting in careful silence around a woman at the head of it who was not eating anything at all. She looked up when I set the plate down. I want to describe her the way she actually was in that moment rather than the way the industry papers describe her, because the papers get it wrong. She was not glamorous in the room. She was still in the specific, expensive way of someone holding a great deal of weight in a very small space. Her eyes were the color of water over slate. When she finally looked at the torte instead of at me, something in her face moved that I don't think anyone at that table had permission to see. She picked up the fork. She tasted it, and then she set the fork down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't entirely steady, and asked the question that started the second half of my life. Who made this? Her voice was quiet. It filled the room anyway. Me, I said. Wren Ashgrove. Pastry, she studied me for 4 full seconds. I counted them, the way I count everything, and said, "This is my mother's recipe exactly." Not close. Exactly, a pause. Corvina never got the last step right in 6 years. I did not know what to say to that, so I said the truth. She never wrote down the burn point. I had to remember it. Something crossed her face that I would only learn to name much later. Recognition, maybe. Or the particular loneliness of a woman who has just discovered that someone, somewhere, was paying closer attention to her life than anyone she paid a salary to. That should have been the whole story right there. A good night, a rare compliment, a return to invisibility in the morning. It wasn't, because at 11:52 that night, 4 hours and most of a very good bottle of Amarone later, I was carrying a crate of clean glasses through the private bar when a hand closed gently around my wrist and Rosenvale, Alpha, owner, feared by an entire industry, pulled me sideways into a booth full of her closest people and said, in a voice gone soft and unguarded around the edges, in a way I would learn was almost never allowed to happen, "There she is." "Come sit, babe." The booth went silent. Odalis's eyebrows climbed somewhere near her hairline. Fen, the sommelier, choked faintly on his wine. And I sat there, with my pulse going wrong in my ears, aware for the first time in my life of exactly how much a room can change its mind about you in under 3 seconds, while a woman half the industry called a wolf tucked herself against my shoulder like it was the safest place in the building, and closed her eyes and did not let go. By the time I got her into a car home that night, because someone had to, and Odalise looked at me like it had already been decided, the whole staff of the Gilded Thorn had watched the Veil Wolf call the kitchen ghost babe in front of witnesses, and not one of them believed for a second that it meant nothing. I believed it meant nothing. I told myself that the entire ride home, watching her sleep against the window with her scent gone soft and unguarded, juniper and spent match smoke instead of the flint sharp version she wore like armor at work. I told myself that the next morning, when I woke up alone in my own bed and my phone had 11 messages from numbers I didn't recognize, all some version of the same question, "Is it true you're dating the Veil Wolf?" I told myself that for exactly 4 days, right up until Odalis Fen called me into the office on the top floor and told me, without a trace of irony, that Miss Vale wanted to see me. I had never once, in 4 years, been inside the executive floor of the Gilded Thorn. The elevator opened onto floors the color of good coffee and a wall of glass looking east over a city that had never once looked back at me. Odalis walked me down the hall like a woman escorting a package she didn't fully trust the contents of, and knocked twice on a door of pale wood before pushing it open without waiting for an answer, which told me more about their relationship than anything either of them ever said aloud. Rosen's office smelled like her, juniper, cold and green, and under it that low note of spent match smoke, like something had burned recently and been put out with care instead of panic. She stood at the window with her back to the door, and for a moment I let myself imagine this was going to be a conversation between equals. "You called me babe in front of 11 people, I said, because someone had to say it, and it clearly wasn't going to be her. She turned around. Her face had gone back to the version the industry papers knew, controlled, unreadable, a door with the lights off behind it. I was aware of that. Do you remember it? A pause that went on a half-second too long. Pieces, that was the wrong answer, and I think some small, hopeful part of me had been braced for a different one. Pieces, I repeated. It was the anniversary of my mother's death, she said, like that was an explanation instead of a wound she was using as a shield. I don't discuss that night. With anyone, I should have let it go. I did not let it go, because 4 years of being invisible had made me very good at reading the difference between a woman who regretted something and a woman who was afraid of it, and this was fear, not regret, and I was tired of being the thing people were afraid of admitting they wanted. The whole restaurant thinks we're together, I said. Your general manager looked at me this morning like I'd been reassigned to a different department. I need you to tell them it was a mistake. It was a mistake, she said, too fast, and something in my chest, something that I'd spent 4 days quietly, stupidly hoping, went very still and very cold. Fine, I said. Good. Consider it forgotten. I walked out before she could see what that cost me, past Odalus, past the elevator bank, all the way down to the kitchen, where Bastian was waiting with a grin already halfway built. Heard the ghost got promoted by proximity, he said, loud enough for the whole line to hear. Didn't last long, did it? I did not cry in front of him. I want that on the record. I went into the walk-in and cried there instead. Quietly, professionally, the way I had learned to do everything, and when I came out I told Odalise I wanted to be moved off the private events roster permanently, and she looked at me for a long moment and said only, understood, in a voice that suggested she understood a great deal more than I'd told her. 2 weeks passed in careful, deliberate distance. I did not go near the executive floor. Rosen did not come into the kitchen. The rumor cooled the way rumors do when nobody feeds them, and I told myself the humiliation had been the whole cost of the thing, and that I had paid it, and now I could go back to being a person nobody looked at twice. Then the first real snowstorm of the year rolled in on a Thursday, the kind the weather service names, and the Gilded Thorn was hosting the preview dinner for the Elodie Vale Foundation Gala the following night, which meant that on the worst night of the year to be anywhere, the entire back of house crew was required to stay late finishing prep. Odalus sent everyone home at 9 as the roads closed, everyone except the 2 people scheduled to finish the dessert inventory for the following night's plating, me. And because she had come downstairs at 8 to check on the storm damage to the loading dock and gotten trapped by the same closed roads as the rest of us. Rosen Vale. The kitchen at 11 at night, snowbound, running on backup generator light because the main grid had flickered twice already, was a different country than the kitchen I knew. Quieter, the steel surfaces threw back gold instead of white. Rosen sat on an overturned crate near my station with her jacket off and her sleeves pushed up, looking less like a wolf and more like a woman who hadn't slept properly in longer than she'd admit, and for 2 hours we worked in something that was almost unbearably like peace. You've been avoiding me, she said, not looking up from the crate of citrus she was sorting, because apparently the Vale wolf sorted her own citrus when there was nothing left to control. You told me it was a mistake, I said. I was respecting that. I lied, she said. Plain, flat no performance in it at all. I stopped what I was doing. Which part? The part where I said pieces. A long breath, the kind that costs something. I remember all of it. I remember every word of it. I have thought about almost nothing else in 17 days. The generator hummed. Somewhere down the hall a pipe ticked with cold. Then, why did you say it didn't mean anything? Because it meant everything, she said, and I did not know what to do with a room full of people watching me want something. I set down the crate I was holding because my hands had started to shake in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. That's not fair to me, I said. You don't get to be a locked door and also be sorry when I stop knocking. I know. She stood up. The distance between us had narrowed without either of us tracking exactly when. Her scent had shifted, gone warmer at the edges, juniper softening into something almost sweet, the way it had that first night in the booth. Tell me to stop, she said quietly. And I will. I mean that. I have meant it since October. I did not tell her to stop. I stepped forward instead, into the 4 inches of space that had been the entire architecture of my restraint for 2 weeks, and said, "Don't." And she kissed me like she'd been rehearsing the apology in her head every night since the anniversary dinner, and this was the only version of it she trusted herself to actually say. It was not performative or practiced. It was careful in the specific way of someone who has broken things by being careless before and has decided, this once, not to. We didn't get further than that, because her phone lit up on the counter at 12:47 with a name I didn't recognize, Odessa. And she went still against me in a way that had nothing to do with wanting to stop, and everything to do with a door somewhere else in her life creaking open. "I have to take this," she said, and something in her voice had already gone back to careful. "Ren, take it," I said, and stepped back and watched her walk to the far end of the kitchen with the phone at her ear, and did not know yet that the woman on the other end of that call was about to become the reason everything nearly fell apart. The storm kept us there until dawn, and in the gray hours before the plows came through, Rosen told me things I don't think she'd said out loud to anyone in years. She told me about her mother, Elodie, who had built the first Veil Table restaurant out of a failing diner, with nothing but stubbornness and a torte recipe she refused to write down completely, so that no one could ever take it whole from her. She told me her father had run the company before her with a doctrine so cold it had a name inside the family. Control is inheritance, he used to say. Feeling is a liability. And that when Elodie died, he'd told Rosen at the funeral to stop crying because Veils did not perform their grief in public. She was 28. She said she had not cried in public since. "I built the company he wanted," she said, staring at the torte recipe I'd finally shown her, my grandmother's burn-scarred card sitting between us on the steel counter like an offering. Feared, efficient, untouchable. I forgot somewhere along the way that untouchable and alone are the same word wearing different coats. I told her about my grandmother, about the fire that had scorched the corner of that card, about my sister Talia, 22 now and in her second year of nursing school on money I'd been quietly sending since she was 16, about the job I'd lost 3 years before this one, when a previous head chef found out I was an omega mid-heat cycle and decided that made me a liability instead of an employee. I told her I had learned to be quiet because loud had cost me things. She listened to all of it without once looking away, and when I finished, she reached across the counter and did not touch me, only asked, "May I?" And I said yes, and she took my hand like it was the most important negotiation she'd ever closed. "I don't do drama," I told her, only half joking, an hour before the sun came up. "I need you to know that, whatever this is, I don't have the stomach for a public mess." "Good," she said. "I don't do audiences." She said it like a vow, though neither of us knew yet how badly that promise was about to be tested. By the time Odalise arrived at 7 with coffee and the news that the roads were finally clear, she found the two of us asleep, sitting up against the pastry counter, my head on Rosenvale's shoulder, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before she said, in a voice I'd never heard her use, 12 years. "I have worked for that woman 12 years, and I have never once seen her wait for anyone." Then she went to find more coffee, and did not mention it again, which from Odalise was the second blessing she'd given me without meaning to. For 9 days after the storm, it was good. It was better than good. Rosen came down to the kitchen twice, which broke some unspoken law of the building and made half the line staff nearly drop their pans. She learned that I liked chamomile tea with a curl of orange peel in it, the way my grandmother used to make it, and one morning I found a small tin of it waiting at my station with no note attached, because she didn't need to sign things to make sure I knew who they were from. Odalus started calling me by my first name. Bastian's comments got quieter, which I understood now had less to do with kindness than with fear, and I would later learn exactly how founded that fear was. The trouble arrived, as it usually does in families like the Vales, wearing good tailoring and calling itself concern. Odessa Vale was Rosen's aunt, her father's sister, vice chair of the Vale Table Group board, and she came to the Gilded Thorn on a Tuesday afternoon in a coat that cost more than my monthly rent, requesting a private word with her niece that somehow ended up happening in the pastry section, because Odessa Vale had never once in her life waited to be shown somewhere. "You've been photographed," Odessa said, not lowering her voice for my benefit, though I was 3 feet away, scraping a bowl I no longer needed to scrape. "Twice this week, with a kitchen employee." She said kitchen employee the way other people say something they'd scraped off a shoe. "The Callaway merger closes in 6 weeks. Rosen, Sabine Callaway, is expecting a partner who understands what this family is, not a glance at me, brief and total. Whatever this is none of your business," Rosen said, and her voice had gone to the flat controlled register I recognized now as the sound of her hiding. "Your father built an empire on discipline," Odessa said. "I am asking you not to burn it down over a girl who reheats desserts." I set the bowl down very carefully, because my hands wanted to shake and I would not give her that. Rosen did not correct her. I want to be fair about what happened next, because at the time it felt like betrayal and it took me a long while afterward to understand it as something closer to paralysis. Rosen stood in that kitchen and said nothing at all. Not one word in my defense, while her aunt dismantled 4 years of my work in 11 seconds, and by the time Odessa turned and walked out, satisfied. I had already decided what it meant. "You didn't say anything," I said. "I was thinking," Rosen said. "That's the problem," I said. "You always are. Everyone in this building is terrified of you, and the one time I needed you to actually use that, you stood there and thought about it." I didn't wait for her answer. I went home that night, and the paper published a photo the next morning under a headline that called me a kitchen nobody, with a caption speculating on how long it would take the Veilwolf to end her latest fling, and I sat at my kitchen table with my grandmother's recipe card in front of me and understood, finally and completely, that I had let myself become exactly the kind of visible I had spent my whole life avoiding, and that it had cost exactly what I'd always feared it would. I typed my resignation letter at 6:14 in the morning, 2 days before the Elodie Vale Foundation Gala, the biggest night of the Gilded Thorns calendar year. I did not send it. I walked it, printed, folded once, to Odalus's office and set it on her desk without a word. She read it standing up. "You're doing this now," she said. 2 days before the gala. The gala she's dedicating to her mother. "I can't be the reason her family cuts her out of a company her mother built," I said. "I've done enough damage." Odalise looked at me for a long moment, and then she did something I hadn't expected, which was to sit down, fold her hands, and say, 12 years I've watched Odessa Vale run that family like a boardroom. Elodie never let her. Elodie used to say the whole point of building something was so you'd have someone to share it with, and Rosen's father spent 30 years trying to make her forget that. I have watched that woman build walls around herself so carefully I stopped believing anyone could find a door. A pause. "You found one." "Do not hand her aunt a hammer. She didn't defend me," I said, and hated how small my voice sounded. "No," Odalus agreed. She froze. "That's not the same thing, but I understand why it feels like it." She slid the resignation letter back across the desk. "Unsigned, unfiled, the torte for the gala needs a pastry chef of record. It has your name on the schedule. I'd like it to stay there. Whatever else you decide it after Saturday. I did not promise anything. I put the letter in my bag instead of the trash, which felt, at the time, like a compromise. What none of us knew yet, what came out only later, in the specific, humiliating way that kitchen truths always come out eventually, was that Bastian Cray had been the one to leak the story to the gossip column that ran the photo, hoping the fallout would finally get the kitchen ghost fired and clear a path for a cousin of his to take the pastry chef title. He had been the one to swap the ganache in October too, betting on my failure the same way he was betting on it now. Some people's cruelty is patient. His had just run out of patience at exactly the wrong moment for him. The gala was held in the Gilded Thorns ballroom, transformed for one night a year into something that looked like the inside of a very good memory. Low gold light, white orchids, 200 guests in a room, built to honor a woman most of them had only met once. I arrived at 4 to start prep, resignation letter still folded in my bag, Torde recipe card in my apron pocket where it always lived, and told myself I would do this one job well, and then I would let it go. Rosen found me at 6, in the narrow hallway behind the kitchen, still in her evening dress with her hair not quite finished, which told me she'd left her own preparations to come find me. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "You have 200 guests," I said. "I have exactly one thing that matters more than any of them," she said. And I let my aunt make her feel small in front of me and said nothing, and I have been sick about it for 4 days. She stepped closer, careful, the way she'd been careful in the kitchen during the storm. I froze because my whole life I've been told that defending what I want in front of witnesses is weakness. My mother knew better. I forgot. I am asking you, not telling you, asking, to give me one more chance to remember out loud, in front of everyone, tonight. Tell me to stop, I said, low, and I will. It was her line, handed back. Don't, she said. And I believed her, finally, all the way down. At 8:52, the foundation's board chair invited Rosenvale to the small stage at the head of the ballroom to say a few words about her mother, the way she did every year, brief and controlled and over inside 90 seconds. This year, she did not stop at 90 seconds. "My mother built this company on one recipe and one rule," she said, into a room gone silent, the way rooms go silent for her. "The recipe most of you have tasted tonight, made exactly as she made it, by the only person in 6 years who ever got the last step right without being told it." She found me in the doorway and did not look away. The rule was simpler. She used to say the whole reason to build something is so you have someone to share it with. My father spent 30 years teaching me to forget that. I let his voice win in this room 4 nights ago, when a person I love was insulted in my own kitchen, and I said nothing. A murmur went through the crowd. Somewhere near the front, Odessa Vale's face had gone the color of old paper. I am not doing that again. Her name is Wren Ashgrove. She is the finest pastry chef this company has ever employed, and the merger my aunt has spent 6 weeks arranging on the assumption that I would choose the family's comfort over my own honesty is over, effective tonight. Because I will not build a marriage to save a business my mother built on the opposite principle. The room did what rooms full of powerful, gossip-hungry people do when the story they came for turns out to be true and better than expected. It went electric. I heard my name repeated in 6 different directions. A culinary critic near the bar, who I would learn the next week, had written 3 separate reviews of the Gilded Thorn without once mentioning who made the desserts, was already writing something in a small notebook, glancing between me and the empty dessert plate on his table. Odessa Vale crossed the room toward the stage with her jaw set, and I watched Rosen's whole body go rigid in the particular way of a woman preparing to say something she could not take back. I got there first. I put my hand flat against her sternum, gentle, and felt her heartbeat slow under my palm the way it had in the kitchen during the storm. "Don't," I said, quiet, just for her. "Don't become the version of you that scares people for no reason. You don't need to win this by destroying her. You've already won it by telling the truth." She looked at me like I'd handed her something she hadn't known she was allowed to want twice in one night. When Odessa reached the stage, Rosen's voice had gone level again, but not cold. "The merger is dead, Odessa, so is the idea that this family gets to choose who I build a life with. You can be in it, or you can watch it from outside. That part is genuinely up to you." Odessa Valle, who had built her entire identity on never once losing a room, stood in front of 200 witnesses and found she had nothing to say. Later, much later, after the gala had ended and the story had already made 3 industry newsletters by morning, the board would quietly strip her proxy voting rights over a separate matter involving falsified merger disclosures Rosen's lawyers uncovered inside the week. But that night, the only punishment she received was silence, which for a woman like Odessa Valle was somehow worse. Bastian Cray's punishment came faster. The critic's notebook, combined with Odalis's own quiet investigation after the ganache incident had never sat right with her, produced enough evidence by the following Monday that he was let go before his next shift. The leaked photo traced back to a number registered in his name. Nobody in that kitchen missed him. I did not either. I found, standing at my station 3 days later, that I had stopped flinching when the walk-in door opened. Rosen found me again near midnight, in the same hallway, and this time there was no phone call, no aunt, no board waiting. "Tell me to stop," she said one more time. Quieter now, her hand at the curve of my jaw, her scent gone warm all the way through, juniper softened into something like the inside of a greenhouse. "I need to hear you say it every time for the rest of this." "Don't," I said again, and meant it more than I had ever meant anything, and when she bent her head to the curve of my neck, to the place where scent gland meets pulse, she asked one more time, plainly, without performance. "Ren, all the way." "Are you asking me to?" And I said yes, and the bite that followed was gentle and certain and changed the chemistry of the room around us. Warmth flooding out from both of us at once until the hallway smelled like nothing but the two of us. Match smoke and blood orange, home, 6 months later, on a morning in April, with the kind of light that makes even a rented backyard look like something out of a painting. Rosenvale got down on one knee in front of my sister, my grandmother's old radio, playing the station Talia had found for the occasion, and asked me to marry her with a ring small enough to fit inside a torte, which is, in fact, exactly where she had hidden it, and which I discovered by biting down on it at 7:31 in the morning in front of 11 witnesses, which she swore afterward was an accident of timing and not, in fact, exactly the kind of theater she'd once claimed not to do. We were bonded properly a year after the gala, in a ceremony small enough to fit in the Gilded Thorn's private room, the same room where a torte had once changed both our lives. Odalise stood as witness and said, in front of everyone, that in 14 years she had never once seen Rosenvale wait for anyone, and now watched her wait happily for a woman still finishing a dessert course in the next room, which she considered, she said, the single greatest transformation of her career. Odessa Vale came. She sat in the second row, quieter than I'd ever seen her, and afterward found me by the dessert table and said, stiffly, that the torte was very good, which from her was an apology in the only language she had left. Talia gave a toast that made her sister-in-law, feared across an entire industry, cry in public for the first time since her mother's funeral, and nobody in that room thought it was weakness. Rosen still calls me her ghost sometimes, low and private, in a voice that used to be Bastian's insult and is now the tenderest word she owns. On our first anniversary, she took me to see snow in the mountains. Real snow. The kind I'd mentioned once, offhand, in a snowbound kitchen a year before, and had apparently never stopped remembering. The napkin from that first drunk night at the bar, the one with babe scrawled across it in her handwriting gone loose with grief and amarone, sits framed now on the wall of the apartment we share above the restaurant her mother built, next to my grandmother's recipe card, its burnt corner catching the morning light the same way it always has. I spent most of my life believing that being unseen was the safest thing I could be. I understand now that it was only the loneliest. The whole reason to build anything, a dish, a company, a life, is so you have someone to share it with, and somewhere in a kitchen full of steam and second chances, I finally let someone see me long enough to prove it true. The end.